So, many people, or shall we say, what a lot of people don't like to talk about is the Suez crisis. Now, believe it or not, last month, shall we say, it was the anniversary of said crisis. In fact, 62 years ago. So, some 62 years ago this month, the foreign policy disaster with which Brexit is often most compared ended in ignominious failure. Suez and the current crisis can both be said to be humiliating experiences in terms of national pride and prestige, but the 1956 collision of hubris and reality hinged on one misjudgment rather than the many that led to today's debacle. Back then, an Anglo-French invasion of the Suez Canal to safeguard strategic and financial interest following Egypt's nationalisation of the waterway was brought to an abrupt end by Washington. The US obtained a United Nations resolution demanding a ceasefire. Instead, insisted that the IMF also discontinue loans to Britain unless the invasion was called off, and prepared to sell US government-owned bonds that were propping up the pound. Humiliated, Britain ceased military operations 9 days after they began. By contrast, the UK's transition from globally respected essential European power to a situation where its Prime Minister has 20 minutes to plead for a deal with the EU over dinner has seemingly no end in sight. So little has changed since the 2016 referendum that Sir Ivan Rogers, formerly the UK's permanent representative to the EU, predicted recently that in 2 years' time we shall still be having the exact same debate over sovereignty, control versus market access. Yet the UK's approach to negotiations to date is merely the latest misstep in a series. And recently, Danny Alexander, Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the Treasury in the coalition years, claimed that he, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chancellor attempted to dissuade David Cameron from promising a referendum on EU membership. Cameron dismissed their concern, Alexander reports arguing that since the next general election could result in another hung parliament, the Lib Dems could simply veto the pledge as the price of a deal. Such a cavalier approach to Brexit, Britain's near half-century strategic relationship with Europe did return insufficient numbers of UKIP voters to the Tory fold, which, combined with the collapse of the Lib Dem support, produced a slim overall Tory majority, saddling the new government with a high-stakes commitment. Many other less risky paths were not taken. Cameron embarked upon a renegotiation of terms with the EU, resulting in minor changes. Subsequently, the implausible spun as significant during the referendum. Yet actual government powers to exercise qualifications of free movement went unused. The referendum's results increased the risk factor. The 1976 Scottish and Welsh Parliament included a threshold of around 40% of the entire electorate to activate their provisions. In the 2014 Scottish independent referendum, 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote, and the 2016 sorry, got something caught in my throat there. The government supported legislation to enfranchise expats that reside outside the UK for some more than 15 years. But the rush to legislate and hold the referendum, no such provisions were included. Beyond these technicalities, the government failed to communicate the basics of the UK's constitution. The MPs were reminded that an accompanying House of Commons briefing paper that the referendum bill does not contain any requirement for the UK government to implement the results of the referendum. Voters were not cautioned of this, or that the Parliament cannot bind another. Following Cameron's hasty departure the day after the referendum, an opportunity arose for his successor to heal the wounds of the narrow, decisive vote. Instead, Theresa May took the hardline approach, ruling out participation in the single market and the customs union and triggering Article 50, then limiting the government's negotiating flexibility. The ill-fated snap general election had the same self-defeating outcome. Hubris met nemesis 2 years later, trying to paper over internal party divisions, and it led to the Chequers proposal to recast the EU's internal market and the customs union, which the EU predictably rejected 2 days later. Now, after successive wrong turns and superficial theatrics, when reality refuses to bend to our wishes, the choices available, having pursued this folly, are clear, although not yet fully sunk in for many Brexiteers. The economically ruinous No Deal, an almost disastrous Canadian free trade agreement that won't cover most of the UK's economy and does not allow for frictionless free trade, requires a hard border in Ireland, or a Norway plus customs union agreement that would minimise Brexit's economic damage and protect the Good Friday Agreement, that means giving up our seat in EU rules that the UK would be the UK would be required to follow. 5 years after a reckless Suez-style blunders fueled by imagined invincibility, mean Britain's risks much a diminished future. Making a final say on any deal with an option to stay look enticing. Let's choose our next step wisely. And this is Barnaby Towns saying this, and this is a former Conservative Party advisor. So here we are, once again looking to damage our national pride, integrity, and this is what happened when I said in the video last week. Brexiteers are not angry at the EU or the government, which they should, this is who they should be, directly at the government, but instead they are angry at reality. It is reality that is meeting, again, their ridiculous promises that none of these things that they promised at the referendum can ever be met. And yet, here we are, 2 years later, buoyed by some people thinking that they'll be riding magical unicorns, post-Brexit, is not going to come true. And all the problems that were still in the, still in the UK, that were still there when we were in the European Union, they're not going to be fixed. They're going to be maximised even more. The problems of this country were never, ever caused by the EU. They were caused by the government. Particularly starting with the coalition government that started deep cuts, including austerity, even though Philip Hammond says they're over. But, there are all these cuts he mentioned in the budget. So, austerity's over, but there's all these cuts. So, yeah, don't believe the hype that austerity's over. And the problems of Brexit, or the people voted for Brexit, are still there. So, leaving the EU is not a solution to these problems. It is only going to make them worse.